She was once full of life, a beloved teacher, a friend, and a wife who seemed to have it all. But beneath the surface, her world was crumbling, slowly being strangled by the man she thought she knew and once loved. What had begun as a passionate love story soon turned into a nightmare of manipulation and abuse. He kept her on a tight leash, monitoring her every move, every call, and every conversation. Her bruises, hidden under layers of makeup and long sleeves, told a story she was too afraid to say out loud. He wasn't just cruel. His anger boiled over into a sadistic rage that she barely survived over and over again. He wasn't just fighting to keep her. He was determined that if he couldn't have her, no one else would. Ashley Scott was the one everyone knew as a friendly teacher and a caring friend. But behind that friendly image was another side of her life, one full of horror and violence. Friends and colleagues noticed how her eyes were gradually losing their former sparkle. No one knew that something much more sinister was going on in her home than just arguments and disagreements. Everyone knew that Ashley wanted a divorce, but for some reason she always backed out at the last minute. Ashley stubbornly refused to seek help from the police, believing it would only make matters worse. Her attempts to keep her family together, despite the constant violence, gradually turned into a death trap from which she could not escape. In the end, her unbearable faith in a possible reconciliation and fear of the unknown led her to the worst possible outcome, where love and fear merged in a tragic finale. On the eve of the tragedy, she received the long-awaited divorce papers, but the crucial steps seemed to remain insurmountable for her. Was it her mistake, or perhaps a death trap? This story is about how love can become a chain, and an attempt to free oneself from it turns into a death sentence. But what really happened behind the walls of that house in the last hours of her life? Why did someone who swore to love and protect her turn into a cold-blooded criminal? Ashley Scott was born in November 1978 in Bossier City, a city in Bossier Parish in the northwestern region of the U.S. state of Louisiana. The population is approximately 65,000. Her childhood was spent surrounded by care and love. Despite the early divorce of her parents, Ashley's mother, seeking to arrange a personal life, met a man named Dennis Youngblood, who not only became a stepfather but took the girl as his own and adopted her. Together, they created a warm family atmosphere in which Ashley grew up cheerful and confident. At school, she was popular, and her bright appearance attracted attention. Ashley was a real beauty. After graduating from high school in 1996, her life took a sharp turn. Ashley met a guy who, as it seemed to her at the time, became her true love. His name was Jeffrey Scott. He was attending Wasabi Baptist University in Arkansas at the time, and Ashley soon enrolled there as well. Even then, it seemed that their relationship was doomed to success. In 2000, after receiving her teaching degree, Ashley decided to dedicate her life to teaching children. Her dream of becoming a teacher was beginning to come true. But behind the facade of the ideal was something more sinister. The couple was inseparable, and Ashley literally glowed as she talked about how kind, caring, and understanding Jeffrey was. This image of the perfect guy was so convincing that Ashley agreed to marry him without hesitation. However, even at the wedding, it became noticeable that not everything was so smooth. Family and friends who traveled to Cord, a suburb of Memphis, to attend the festivities were wary. Jeffrey seemed friendly and courteous at first glance, but his mask of politeness hid his arrogance and contempt for Ashley's entourage. A few arguments broke out at the gala, and some of the guests began to question her choice. But Ashley, blinded by feelings, stubbornly defended her chosen one. Over time, this relationship poisoned her life. Gradually, Ashley became more and more distant from her family and loved ones. Jeffrey began to control her every move, and without realizing it, she found herself in the grip of a toxic attachment. Few friends remained close, but even they tried to keep their distance. In 2003, Ashley began teaching at a middle school in suburban Memphis, where she quickly gained the respect of her colleagues and the love of her students. Everything seemed to be going great for her at work, but a very different reality awaited her at home. These years became a struggle for Ashley between her personal and public image. At school, she remained smiling and friendly, but at home, she was losing herself, living under constant pressure. With each passing year, her bond with her family weakened, and her relationship with Jeffrey fell deeper and deeper into darkness and fear. Ashley rarely shared details of her personal life, claiming that her marriage and the move were purely her choice. She reassured those around her that everything that happened was the result of her own decisions. But these words hid a bitter truth. Her reasoning had long been influenced by a manipulator, her husband, Jeff. Even in the early stages of their relationship, he began implementing a typical abuser's plan, cutting Ashley off from friends and family. Isolation is the first step to total control. Jeff purposely destroyed her ties with loved ones, leaving her without support. Gradually, he switched to her self-esteem, undermining her confidence on a daily basis. Constant nagging, humiliation, and accusations became a regular part of her life. Ashley fell deeper and deeper into despair, feeling helpless and unwanted. Her only link to her old life was her best friend, Lori, whom she'd been friends with since 5th grade. Lori knew something was wrong and tried her best to support Ashley, but even she couldn't imagine the horror that would soon unfold at her friend's house. The most paradoxical thing about this story is that even in the midst of constant violence and fear, Ashley still seemed to have hope for a happy marriage. Shortly before the fateful day, Jeffrey bought a new house, which they were going to furnish together. Neighbors and acquaintances saw the couple choosing a place to live and discussing plans for the future. It seemed that between them, there really remained some illusion of happiness. Moreover, Ashley started taking medication to plan a pregnancy, which looked like a desperate attempt to find a drop of happiness in this nightmare. In the aftermath, this contradictory information stunned the investigators. How could such a display of marital harmony coexist with frightening stories of beatings and threats? Some speculated that Ashley was deliberately creating a semblance of normalcy in order not to arouse the suspicions of her increasingly dangerous husband. Others, however, believed it was much worse. Perhaps Ashley had become so psychologically dependent on Jeffrey that she could no longer imagine life without him, even in the face of obvious threats. November 23, 2006 was Thanksgiving Day. Memphis Emergency Services received a disturbing call from Jeffrey Scott. The man's cold and completely calm voice informed the dispatcher that his wife was unconscious. He clarified that she was still breathing but unresponsive to anything. Suddenly, another voice was heard in the background, someone grimly stating that the woman was probably dead. That was enough for the emergency operators to suspect something wrong. The call was immediately passed on to management, and police officers rushed to the scene, ready to confront something far more sinister than the usual accident. Police officers arrived on the scene within minutes. Upon entering the house, they went straight to the bedroom, where a woman lay motionless on the cold floor. Over her body leaned Dr. Robert McGee, who unsuccessfully tried to bring her back to life. It was his voice that the dispatcher could faintly hear in the background as Jeffrey Scott called for emergency services. But that wasn't what was strange. Jeffrey's very demeanor was literally etched into the memory of every officer who arrived at the call. Instead of panic or fear, he seemed suspiciously calm, as if everything that was happening was nothing more than a minor domestic nuisance. He spoke to the police with an icy coolness, claiming that he and his wife had been drinking the night before, and then Ashley had suddenly felt ill and gone to bed. In the morning, according to Jeffrey, he found her unconscious and first called his friend Dr. McGee, insisting that he'd come immediately. At that point, Dr. McGee was returning home with his family and was unable to get to him right away. When he did get to the Scott home, he was confronted with a frightening scene. His friend was standing next to his wife's lifeless body, and something heavy and ominous hung in the air. At once, McGee thought that there might have been a serious quarrel between the couple, which ended in tragedy. However, not wanting to make a fuss, he quickly drove his wife and children out, preferring to leave the situation within the family. Returning an hour later, McGee was horrified to realize that Ashley's condition was critical, if she was still alive at all. The doctor was certain that something far worse had happened here than a simple family quarrel. He urged Jeffrey to call an ambulance immediately. Realizing that he was facing a possible murder scene, McGee deliberately detained Jeffrey until the police arrived, sensing that the truth might be much darker than it first appeared. Soon, talking to the police, the doctor shared what he had long suspected about the troubled relationship in the Scott family. He knew that the couple's marriage had been on the rocks for a long time. Ashley was increasingly resorting to alcohol, and Jeffrey, losing control, regularly resorted to physical violence. Everything pointed to the fact that that evening was the culmination of a long and painful conflict. And now all that remained was to find out what exactly had happened behind the closed doors of the house where love had long ago turned into fear and despair. Jeffrey was immediately apprehended and sent to the patrol car. There, he adjusted his version of events, claiming that the scandal with his wife had erupted because of a text message from her alleged lover that he had accidentally discovered on her phone. However, while Jeffrey was trying to justify his actions, detectives began to examine the crime scene. The picture they discovered in the house only reinforced their dark suspicions. Ashley's passport, phone, and purse were on the kitchen table, neatly stacked next to a printed email and a laptop computer. Those details hinted at hasty packing, as if Ashley had been trying to leave the house quickly. But there was a clear sign of a struggle in the living room. Scattered items, a broken vase, and things pulled off shelves indicated panicked resistance. Both of the couple's cars were in the garage, and most alarmingly, Ashley's clothes were hanging on hangers inside. Ashley's Volkswagen on the garage floor had bedding with bloodstains on it. All indications were that she had planned to leave, but something had stopped her plans and apparently stopped them for good. The first person to assess Ashley's condition was a paramedic from the local medical service. He immediately noted the serious injuries that spoke for themselves. Severe blunt force trauma to the head, multiple contusions all over her body, on her legs, chest, and back. There was no blood pressure or pulse, and her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light. Particularly horrifying was the bloody vomit dripping from her mouth and nose, indicating internal injuries. The paramedic also noticed a distinctive green tint to the right ear, typical of injuries caused by multiple blows to the same spot. A huge bruise in the shape of a boot mark was clearly visible on her back, as if the woman had been stomped on while she was lying on the floor. When the doctors arrived, they tried to use a defibrillator 4 times and administer powerful drugs to bring Ashley back to life. But all were unsuccessful. Even after that, they continued to perform CPR, unwilling to give up. Eventually, she was rushed to the hospital. Surprisingly, on the way, Ashley's heart continued to barely beat, even though there was almost no chance of survival. The doctors realized that they were looking at a woman who had been tortured, and the fight for her life now depended only on a miracle. In the emergency room, the neurosurgeon quickly realized that the patient was at her limit, and her condition was beyond repair. Ashley's brain was in an agonal state. All of her body's systems were shutting down one by one, and her vital organs were beginning to fail. After several minutes of fighting for Ashley's life, surgeons made the decision to take her off life support. Ashley passed away, and her life was tragically cut short. With this horrific event, Jeffrey Scott came into the spotlight as the prime suspect in the crime. Charges were filed immediately, and he was taken into custody. During the autopsy, the medical examiner found over 50 hematomas throughout the deceased's body, many of which were in various stages of healing. These injuries indicated systematic violence and prolonged beating. The cause of death turned out to be a subdural hematoma on the right side of the brain, which caused a coma and massive internal bleeding. This injury led to cardiac arrest as the brain hit the walls of the skull, causing catastrophic bleeding and disrupting the oxygen supply to vital organs. The most gruesome thing about this tragedy is that if Ashley had received timely medical attention, perhaps her life could have been saved. But instead, her agony continued until it was too late. Under questioning, Jeffrey admitted that he didn't call his friend, a doctor, until 8 hours after the altercation. All this time, Ashley was in critical condition, not receiving the medical attention she needed, and desperately fighting for her life. According to Jeffrey, the conflict stemmed from suspicious messages from an alleged lover that he allegedly found on his wife's phone. In a fit of passion, he hit her in the head once and then sent her into the garage, throwing her a blanket and pillow, leaving her in the dirt amid torn bedding and bloodstains. Ashley, bloodied and severely traumatized, was forced to lie on the cold floor in pain and cold, while her husband rested peacefully in the bedroom. The trial of Jeffrey Scott began on January 13, 2009. In the dock was a man whose life and reputation were in danger of being destroyed. It centered on Lori, the victim's best friend, who shared her memories of troubling signs long before the tragedy. Beginning in November 2005, Jeff began calling Lori frequently, complaining about Ashley. He said that his wife had begun abusing alcohol, frequently fell, and suffered bruises whose origin she could not explain. According to him, Ashley blamed him for the abuse, but Jeff claimed that the true cause of her injuries was her own actions in bad company, especially a friend named Blair Brown. Lori thought the calls were strange and suspicious, believing that Jeff was thus trying to create an alibi for himself in case of domestic violence charges. Lori knew full well that Ashley had been the victim of systematic abuse that had gone on for years. At trial, Jeffrey presented a different version of events, claiming that his wife allegedly had several lovers. According to him, Ashley manipulated them by pretending to be a victim and professing her love, although she herself had no true emotions for them. Jeff even stated that he no longer wanted Ashley to be the mother of his child because of her lifestyle and general condition, which disgusted him. Shortly before the tragedy, the Scott couple were at dinner with the doctor who later tried to save Ashley. On the advice of this doctor, Jeff stopped restricting Ashley's communication with Lori. From that point on, Ashley resumed communicating with her friend, but her stories became dark and disturbing. She reported that Jeff was becoming increasingly aggressive and violent, humiliating and beating her almost daily. These words seemed plausible, especially given the state of her body. While Ashley had indeed begun to abuse alcohol, which partially confirmed what her husband had said, such massive bruises could not have been sustained simply from accidental falls. The injuries she had suffered spoke of systematic abuse, and what was happening to her was far from accidental or minor falls. In September 2006, Lori saw her friend Ashley for the last time when she visited for the weekend. During their trip to the store, Ashley wistfully told her how much control her husband Jeff had over her money and spending. She only bought the essentials, even though she clearly wanted many other things. Jeff called her almost nonstop, wondering what she was wearing and where she was. His insistence and attempts to cause Ashley conflict seemed like a veiled form of control and manipulation. Lori noticed that her friend avoided discussing their marriage, admitting that she was afraid to leave her husband because his reactions could be unpredictable and dangerous. She admitted to at least 3 people close to her that Jeffrey had repeatedly clutched her throat, leaving her exhausted and on the verge of death. Each time, she found excuses for his actions and convinced herself that things could still be fixed. This illusion of hope, which turned out to be fatal, cost her life. Not a month later, Ashley turned to Rachel, a divorce attorney, for help. Rachel understood the depth of Ashley's distress and tried to help, but unfortunately, she could not prevent disaster. Now her only task was to testify at the trial against Jeff, whom she believed was responsible for her client's murder. Ashley had gotten Rachel's phone number a year earlier, in August 2005, when she was arrested for drunk driving. At that time, Rachel had helped her avoid serious consequences, and then Ashley learned that the lawyer specialized in divorce proceedings. In her conversations with Rachel, Ashley shared frightening details about how Jeff physically abused her. She recounted how on the night she was arrested for drunkenness, Jeff had beaten her in a bar and kicked her home while taking her shoes from her. This incident frightened her to the point where she drove drunk so that she would not have to walk home at night barefoot. One of the most shocking episodes occurred when Jeffrey threw her dog out of the car in a fit of anger. For Ashley, it was a turning point. She could barely hold back tears and literally became hysterical. The animal miraculously survived but was severely injured and took weeks to recover. Despite the horror of the situation, Ashley again did not dare to go to the police. Her mind was clouded with guilt. Jeffrey had convinced her that the attack on the poor animal was supposedly her own fault. He skillfully manipulated her feelings, reducing the guilt to her misbehavior. It was a trap of psychological abuse from which Ashley could not find a way out. Ashley could not fully disclose the details of her fear and pain for fear of her husband's retaliation. She didn't have the funds to pay for an attorney, but Rachel, seeing the true victim of abuse in front of her, agreed to help virtually free of charge, charging only a token fee of $1. Rachel offered Ashley several possible ways out of her horrible situation, but Ashley admitted that she had already made attempts to escape, only to have her husband Jeff threaten to kill her if she tried it again. She revealed that Jeff had been aggressive since their time in college, but over the past year, his violence and bullying had reached a breaking point. Every day became a real challenge, where any action she took could be the spark that ignited his rage. The fear of her husband was so great that Ashley tried to drown it in alcohol to get through the unrelenting terror. For a year, Rachel and Ashley kept in contact, meeting in person or communicating via payphones to avoid suspicion from Jeff. Ashley was under constant scrutiny. Her husband checked her cell phone, demanding accountability for every text and call, and these checks often ended in arguments and new injuries. Friends and acquaintances constantly noticed the bruises on her body. Ashley recounted that Jeff beat her with his feet, preferring to knock her down and then kick her. The medical examiner confirmed these horrific accounts by finding shoe marks on her body. Meanwhile, Jeff was not shy about bringing home mistresses, and bluntly told Ashley that she disgusted him and that he did not want to be intimate with her. These humiliations and constant abuse plunged Ashley into a deep depression. She left her job and tried to cope with the pain with the help of alcohol, but only sank deeper into alcohol addiction. Over the past 6 months, her life had become a series of agonizing days, each of which she couldn't spend without a drink. Her hopes for salvation were melting away as her final strength melted away. Ashley's former co-workers, school principal, and teachers spoke at the trial. They all reported that they had become increasingly concerned about her condition in recent months. They noticed that Ashley constantly used a lot of makeup in an apparent attempt to cover up the beatings and wore long-sleeved clothing even in the hottest weather to cover up the bruise marks. These signs alerted colleagues, who urged Ashley to break off her relationship with Jeff and go to the police. They were convinced that her marriage had become a real danger, but despite the warnings, Ashley sought to avoid conflict and minimize problems. Even her students noticed that with each passing month before her death, she became more withdrawn and didn't socialize like she used to. The problems were obvious, but when asked, she would often give false explanations, hiding the real reasons for her depressed state. The most shocking details of the abuse came from Rachel, the divorce lawyer. After one particularly horrific incident, Rachel realized that her client was in mortal danger. Jeff wasn't just cruel, he was monstrously brutal. The shoe marks on Ashley's body were no accident. He often rolled her on the floor and then beat her with his feet. On one occasion, he even strangled her by stepping on her throat. Ashley, exhausted, begged him to stop, but Jeff, in a fit of rage, screamed that he wanted her dead. The day before her death, Ashley called Rachel to inform her that she had received the divorce papers. Rachel was in a different city at the time and couldn't take care of the case right away, but she insisted that Ashley leave her husband immediately. She recommended that she not communicate with Jeff, pack her things, and leave while he was away so as not to risk her life. This last hope of salvation, unfortunately, proved to be too late. Despite her growing sense of hopelessness and fear of the future, Ashley was determined to talk to her husband peacefully, to explain her decision and set the record straight. She gathered her things, carefully packing her clothes, passport, and important documents that were necessary for her departure. Everything was ready. She put her things in the car. However, despite Rachel's advice, who urged her to leave immediately and have no contact with Jeff, Ashley decided to take a chance and try to explain everything to her husband. That move proved to be fatal. Intriguing details surfaced about Blair Brown, Ashley's friend, whom Jeff hated intensely and considered the source of all his troubles. In fact, Blair knew Jeff far more deeply than was realized. She was his former lover and knew more about his darker side than anyone else. When Ashley had met Blair about 6 months before the tragedy, she had immediately felt supportive and sympathetic. Blair actively supported her during difficult times, and they often spent time together to take her mind off her problems. Blair became a sort of refuge for Ashley, a place she could escape to after particularly terrible conflicts with her husband. One day, Jeff, desperate to find his wife, tracked her down at Blair's house. Suddenly breaking into his ex-lover's house, he created a real nightmare. He hit Ashley several times, then threw her out into the street, leaving her in a terrible state. Despite these blatant acts of violence, Ashley continued to refuse to go to the police, not wanting to complicate an already difficult situation. Thanks to Blair, who became a key witness, a new significant figure in Ashley's life became known in court. A few months before the tragedy, Ashley had been in a relationship with a man named Michael Lowe. The relationship was more than just a fling. Michael became for her a symbol of a new life and a hope for a future free of violence and fear. They planned a future together after the divorce, and Ashley was already planning to move in with Michael. But alas, her dreams never came true. At the trial, Michael Lowe confirmed that their romance developed rapidly and seriously. According to him, on the day when the crime occurred, they talked on the phone several times. Ashley was in high spirits, preparing to finally end her relationship with Jeff and start a new life with him. Michael recounted that Ashley seemed determined and hopeful, as her plans centered on a radical life change. To corroborate Michael's words, text messages that Ashley and Michael exchanged via social media were decrypted. These correspondences became an important piece of evidence. They contained not only plans for the future, but also intimate photos that Ashley sent to Michael between October 29th and November 22nd, 2006. Printouts of these messages were found in Jeff's home after police arrived there. The discovery was shocking. It confirmed that Jeff was aware of his wife's new relationship, and it was likely that this information could have been the reason for his aggressive behavior. The evidence uncovered painted a frightening picture. Not only had Jeff learned of his wife's affair, but he was probably experiencing mania, jealousy, and rage. This emphasized the danger Ashley was in and added to the tragic nature of her final days. That terrible evening, as the conflict reached its climax, Jeff showed Ashley the correspondences found on her laptop. These messages, revealing her affair with Michael Lowe, were the catalyst for the gruesome fight. Ashley, in desperation, tried to run away, but Jeff was willing to do anything to keep her from leaving. His aggression reached its peak when he beat her to a pulp. Eventually, Ashley managed to get to the garage, but there was an even greater tragedy waiting for her. She received a fatal blow to the head and lost consciousness. Jeff, realizing her condition was critical, just threw blankets and pillows on the floor without bothering to call an ambulance. At that point, he clearly didn't care if Ashley was still alive or not. In his own words, this all happened around 1 a.m., but it wasn't until 9 a.m., when he had already recovered from the first wave of shock, that he finally carried Ashley back into the house and laid her in front of the fireplace, hoping the warmth would help her regain consciousness. Later, he planned to move her to the bedroom. It wasn't until about 8 hours later, when Dr. Robert McGee, tired from the overnight trip, arrived at the house that he immediately realized the seriousness of Ashley's condition. The doctor saw that there was almost no chance of survival, but even after that, Jeff continued to remain silent. Emergency services were not called until 12 hours after her injuries, when she was already on the verge of life and death. These hours without medical attention showed that Jeff realized how severely injured his wife was. But instead of seeking help, he left her to fend for herself. Prosecutors argued that he deliberately delayed, hoping Ashley would die and he wouldn't have to be held responsible. During the trial, the dispatcher who took the call said that the conversation with Jeff was incredibly cold and indifferent, as if he was just ordering at a fast food place. Even after Ashley was taken to the hospital and Jeff himself was in police custody, he was more interested in who won the last soccer game than his wife's condition. This complete callousness and detachment only emphasized how insignificant to him was the life of the woman he was about to build a future with. Jeffrey Scott's attorney tried to convince the court that Ashley was suffering from alcoholic ketoacidosis, a condition that can cause seizures and falls. In his opinion, these seizures could have been the cause of the injuries Jeffrey described when he was socializing with Ashley's girlfriend. Despite the apparent absurdity of this argument, there was an independent expert who confirmed this theory, adding more confusion to the case. To disprove this theory, another expert had to be brought in, the county's assistant medical examiner. He reported shocking details, more than 50 hematomas on the victim's body, which clearly could not be the result of accidental falls. The shoe marks on Ashley's body were especially terrible. These marks indicated that her body had been jumped on. Her beatings were systematic and brutal. Forensic examination established that the cause of death was a head injury, which could only have occurred after multiple severe blows to the same point on the head. This clearly disproved the idea of accidental falls. Jeffrey's attorney also insisted that the defendant was not an aggressor but a victim, a man struggling to save his marriage to a woman who sent intimate photos to another man and abused alcohol. The defense attorney portrayed Jeffrey as a desperate husband who, upon learning of the affair, lost his temper and made a fatal mistake. Despite these arguments, prosecutors will emphasize that Ashley's last hours were hell. She tried to leave her husband but not to hide, hoping for at least some kind of peaceful conversation. This decision turned out to be fatal. Ashley desperately tried to hide the reality of her marriage, each time embellishing the situation to loved ones and trying to find excuses for her husband's behavior. She convinced herself and others that provocation or random circumstances were to blame for everything. But she stubbornly refused to admit the obvious. A cruel and dangerous monster lived next to her. When the jury retired to deliberate on the verdict, no one expected this turn of events. When they returned, they found Jeffrey Scott guilty of only second-degree murder. This verdict was so shocking that even the judge expressed his displeasure. He emphasized that Jeffrey Scott could have called for help and saved Ashley's life from the beginning, but instead continued to watch her condition deteriorate with indifference, indicating his intent to let her die. The judge considered this a premeditated murder, not an accidental occurrence. Nevertheless, the verdict came down, and Jeffrey Scott was sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. He is serving his sentence at the Bledsoe County Correctional Complex in Pikeville, Tennessee. Jeffrey will remain in prison until April 2030, when his sentence expires, remaining a symbol of justice that was not completely fair. After the tragedy of Ashley Scott murder, the National Domestic Violence Hotline conducted a frightening study. It turned out that women who survive strangulation by a partner are 10 times more likely to be victims of reprisal in the next conflict. This statistic seemed to foreshadow the fate of Ashley, who, despite all the horrors, continued to believe in the possibility of saving her marriage.